This is a dramatization of selections from Karl Marx's pamphlet The Civil War in France, meant to align with the Marx-Engles Reader but sourced from Marxists.org. There will be some differences in grammar and vocabulary choices and likely some significant pronunciation issues given this is generated with text-to-speech software. And these were exceedingly long pieces to work through and we needed this done rather quickly. Please accept my apologies and this labor in the good faith they are intended. The selections will begin with the introduction by Friedrich Engels and go on to include chapters 3 and 4. They will all be voiced by this channel's creator, the Madd Addam.
I did not anticipate that I would be asked to prepare a new edition of the address of the General Council of the International on the Civil War in France, and to write an introduction to it. Therefore, I can only touch briefly here on the most important points. I am prefacing the longer work mentioned above by the two shorter addresses of the General Council on the Franco-Prussian War. In the first place, because the second of these, which itself cannot be fully understood without the first, is referred to in the Civil War. But also because these two addresses, likewise drafted by Marx, are, no less than the Civil War, outstanding examples of the author's remarkable gift, first proved in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, for grasping clearly the character, the import, and the necessary consequences of great historical events, at a time when these events are still in process before our eyes, or have only just taken place. And, finally, because we in Germany are still having to endure the consequences which Marx prophesied would follow from these events. Has that which was declared in the first address not come to pass, that if Germany's defensive war against Louis Bonaparte degenerated into a war of conquest against the French people, all the misfortunes which befell Germany after the so-called wars of liberation would revive again with renewed intensity? Have we not had a further 20 years of Bismarck's government, the exceptional law and the anti-socialist campaign taking the place of the prosecutions of demagogues, with the same arbitrary police measures and with literally the same staggering interpretations of the law? And has not the prophecy been proved to the letter that the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine would force France into the arms of Russia, and that after this annexation Germany must either become the avowed tool of Russia, or must, after some short respite, arm for a new war, and, moreover, a race war against the combined Slavonic and Roman races? Has not the annexation of the French provinces driven France into the arms of Russia? Has not Bismarck for fully 20 years vainly wooed the favor of the Tsar, wooed it with services even more lowly than those which Little Prussia, before it became the first power in Europe, was wont to lay at Holy Russia's feet? And is there not every day hanging over our heads the Damocles' sword of war, on the first day of which all the chartered covenants of princes will be scattered like chaff, a war of which nothing is certain but the absolute uncertainty of its outcome, a race war which will subject the whole of Europe to devastation by 15 or 20 million armed men, and is only not already raging because even the strongest of the great military states shrinks before the absolute incalculability of its final outcome? All the more is it our duty to make again accessible to the German workers these brilliant proofs, now half forgotten, of the far-sightedness of the international working-class policy in 1870. What is true of these two addresses is also true of the Civil War in France. On May 28th, the last fighters of the Commune succumbed to superior forces on the slopes of Belleville, and only 2 days later, on May 30th, Marx read to the General Council the work in which the historical significance of the Paris Commune is delineated in short, powerful strokes, but with such clearness, and above all such truth, as has never again been attained on all the massive literature which has been written on this subject. Thanks to the economic and political development of France since 1789, Paris has been placed for the last 50 years in such a position that no revolution could break out there without assuming a proletarian character. That is to say, without the proletariat, which had bought victory with its blood, coming forward with its own demands after the victory. These demands were more or less unclear and even confused, corresponding to the state of development reached by the workers of Paris at the particular period. But in the last resort they all amounted to the abolition of the class antagonism between capitalists and workers. It is true that no one knew how this was to be brought about, but the demand itself, however indefinitely it still was couched, contained a threat to the existing order of society. The workers who put it forward were still armed. Therefore, the disarming of the workers was the first commandment for the bourgeois, who were at the helm of the state. Hence, after every revolution won by the workers, a new struggle, ending with the defeat of the workers. This happened for the first time in 1848. The liberal bourgeois of the parliamentary opposition held banquets for securing a reform of the franchise, which was to ensure supremacy for their party. Forced more and more, in their struggle with the government, to appeal to the people, they had gradually to yield precedence to the radical and republican strata of the bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie. But behind these stood the revolutionary workers, and since 1830 they had acquired far more political independence than the bourgeois, and even the Republicans, suspected. At the moment of the crisis between the government and the opposition, the workers began street fighting. Louis-Philippe vanished, and with him the franchise reform, and in its place arose the Republic, and indeed one which the victorious workers themselves designated as a social republic. No one, however, was clear as to what this social republic was to imply, not even the workers themselves. But they now had arms and were a power in the state. Therefore, as soon as the bourgeois Republicans in control felt something like firm ground under their feet, their first aim was to disarm the workers. This took place by driving them into the insurrection of June 1848 by direct breach of faith, by open defiance, and the attempt to banish the unemployed to a distant province. The government had taken care to have an overwhelming superiority of force. After 5 days' heroic struggle, the workers were defeated, and then followed a bloodbath among the defenseless prisoners, the like of which has not been seen since the days of the civil wars which ushered in the downfall of the Roman Republic. It was the first time that the bourgeoisie showed to what insane cruelties of revenge it will be goaded the moment the proletariat dares to take its stand against the bourgeoisie as a separate class with its own interests and demands. And yet 1848 was only child's play compared with the frenzy of the bourgeoisie in 1871. Punishment followed hard at heel. If the proletariat was not yet able to rule France, the bourgeoisie could no longer do so, at least not at that period, when the greater part of it was still monarchically inclined, and it was divided into 3 dynastic parties and a 4th, Republican party. Its internal dissensions allowed the adventurer Louis Bonaparte to take possession of all the commanding points, army, police, administrative machinery, and, on December 2, 1851, to explode the last stronghold of the bourgeoisie, the National Assembly. The Second Empire began. The exploitation of France by a gang of political and financial adventurers, but at the same time also an industrial development such as had never been possible under the narrow-minded and timorous system of Louis-Philippe, with the exclusive domination of only a small section of the big bourgeoisie. Louis Bonaparte took the political power from the capitalists under the pretext of protecting them, the bourgeois, from the workers, and on the other hand the workers from them. But in return his rule encouraged speculation and industrial activity, in a word, the upsurgence and enrichment of the whole bourgeoisie to an extent hitherto unknown. To an even greater extent, it is true, corruption and mass thievery developed, clustering around the imperial court, and drawing their heavy percentages from this enrichment. But the Second Empire was the appeal to French chauvinism, was the demand for the restoration of the frontiers of the First Empire, which had been lost in 1814, or at least those of the First Republic, a French empire within the frontiers of the old monarchy, and, in fact, within the even more amputated frontiers of 1815, such a thing was impossible for any length of time. Hence the necessity for occasional wars and extensions of frontiers. But no extension of frontiers was so dazzling to the imagination of the French chauvinists as the extension to the German left bank of the Rhine. 1 square mile on the Rhine was more to them than 10 in the Alps or anywhere else. Given the Second Empire, the demand for the restoration of the left bank of the Rhine, either all at once or piecemeal, was merely a question of time. The time came with the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, cheated of the anticipated territorial compensation by Bismarck and by his own overcunning, hesitant policy. There was now nothing left for Napoleon but war, which broke out in 1870 and drove him first to Sedan, and thence to Wilhelmshohe. The necessary consequence was the Paris Revolution of September 4, 1870. The empire collapsed like a house of cards, and the Republic was again proclaimed. But the enemy was standing at the gates. The armies of the empire were either hopelessly encircled at Metz or held captive in Germany. In this emergency the people allowed the Paris deputies to the former legislative body to constitute themselves into a government of national defense. This was the more readily conceded, since, for the purposes of defense, all Parisians capable of bearing arms had enrolled in the National Guard and were armed, so that now the workers constituted a great majority. But very soon the antagonism between the almost completely bourgeois government and the armed proletariat broke into open conflict. On October 31st, workers' battalions stormed the town hall and captured part of the membership of the government. Treachery, the government's direct breach of its undertakings, and the intervention of some petty bourgeois battalions set them free again. And in order not to occasion the outbreak of civil war inside a city besieged by a foreign military power, the former government was left in office. At last, on January 28, 1871, starved Paris capitulated, but with honors unprecedented in the history of war. The forts were surrendered. The city wall stripped of guns, the weapons of the regiments of the line and of the mobile guard were handed over, and they themselves considered prisoners of war. But the National Guard kept its weapons and guns, and only entered into an armistice with the victors. And these did not dare enter Paris in triumph. They only dared to occupy a tiny corner of Paris, which, into the bargain, consisted partly of public parks, and even this they only occupied for a few days. And during this time they, who had maintained their encirclement of Paris for 131 days, were themselves encircled by the armed workers of Paris, who kept a sharp watch that no Prussian should overstep the narrow bounds of the corner ceded to the foreign conqueror. Such was the respect which the Paris workers inspired in the army before which all the armies of the empire had laid down their arms, and the Prussian Junkers, who had come to take revenge at the home of the revolution, were compelled to stand by respectfully and salute precisely this armed revolution. During the war the Paris workers had confined themselves to demanding the vigorous prosecution of the fight. But now, when peace had come after the capitulation of Paris, now Thiers, the new supreme head of the government, was compelled to realize that the rule of the propertied classes, big landowners and capitalists, was in constant danger so long as the workers of Paris had arms in their hands. His first action was an attempt to disarm them. On March 18th, he sent troops of the line with orders to rob the National Guard of the artillery belonging to it, which had been constructed during the siege of Paris and had been paid for by public subscription. The attempt failed. Paris mobilized as one man for resistance, and war between Paris and the French government sitting at Versailles was declared. On March 26th the Paris Commune was elected, and on March 28th it was proclaimed. The Central Committee of the National Guard, which up to then had carried on the government, handed in its resignation to the Commune after it had first decreed the abolition of the scandalous Paris morality police. On March 30th the Commune abolished conscription in the standing army, and declared the sole armed force to be the National Guard, in which all citizens capable of bearing arms were to be enrolled. It remitted all payments of rent for dwelling houses from October 1870 until April, the amounts already paid to be booked as future rent payments, and stopped all sales of articles pledged in the municipal loan office. On the same day the foreigners elected to the Commune were confirmed in office, because the flag of the Commune is the flag of the World Republic. On April it was decided that the highest salary to be received by any employee of the Commune, and therefore also by its members themselves, was not to exceed 6,000 francs. On the following day the Commune decreed the separation of the Church from the state, and the abolition of all state payments for religious purposes, as well as the transformation of all church property into national property, as a result of which, on April 8th, the exclusion from the schools of all religious symbols, pictures, dogmas, prayers, in a word, of all that belongs to the sphere of the individual's conscience, was ordered and gradually put into effect. On the 5th, in reply to the shooting, day after day, of captured Commune fighters by the Versailles troops, a decree was issued for the imprisonment of hostages, but it was never carried into execution. On the 6th, the guillotine was brought out by the 137th Battalion of the National Guard and publicly burnt, amid great popular rejoicing. On the 12th, the Commune decided that the Victory Column on the Place Vendôme, which had been cast from captured guns by Napoleon after the War of 1809, should be demolished as a symbol of chauvinism and incitement to national hatred. This was carried out on May 16th. On April 16th it ordered a statistical tabulation of factories which had been closed down by the manufacturers, and the working out of plans for the operation of these factories by the workers formerly employed in them, who were to be organized in cooperative societies, and also plans for the organization of these cooperatives in one great union. On the 20th it abolished night work for bakers, and also the employment offices, which since the Second Empire had been run as a monopoly by creatures appointed by the police, labor exploiters of the first rank. These offices were transferred to the mayoralties of the 20 arrondissements of Paris. On April 30th it ordered the closing of the pawn shops, on the ground that they were a private exploitation of the workers, and were in contradiction with the right of the workers to their instruments of labor and to credit. On May 5th it ordered the raising of the Chapel of Atonement, which had been built in expiation of the execution of Louis XVI. Thus from March 18th onwards the class character of the Paris movement, which had previously been pushed into the background by the fight against the foreign invaders, emerged sharply and clearly, as almost only workers, or recognized representatives of the workers, sat in the Commune. Its decisions bore a decidedly proletarian character. Either these decisions decreed reforms which the Republican bourgeoisie had failed to pass solely out of cowardice, but which provided a necessary basis for the free activity of the working class, such as the realization of the principle that in relation to the state, religion is a purely private matter, or the Commune promulgated decrees which were in the direct interest of the working class and in part cut deeply into the old order of society. In a beleaguered city, however, it was possible to make at most a start in the realization of all this, and from the beginning of May onwards all their energies were taken up by the fight against the armies assembled by the Versailles government in ever-growing numbers. On April 7th, the Versailles troops had captured the Seine crossing at Neuilly, on the western front of Paris. On the other hand, in an attack on the southern front on the 11th, they were repulsed with heavy losses by General Eudes. Paris was continually bombarded and, moreover, by the very people who had stigmatized as a sacrilege the bombardment of the same city by the Prussians. These same people now begged the Prussian government for the hasty return of the French soldiers taken prisoner at Sedan and Metz, in order that they might recapture Paris for them. From the beginning of May, the gradual arrival of these troops gave the Versailles force a decided superiority. This already became evident when, on April 23rd, Thiers broke off the negotiations for the exchange, proposed by the Commune, of the Archbishop of Paris and a whole number of other priests held as hostages in Paris, for only one man, Blanqui, who had twice been elected to the Commune but was a prisoner in Clairvaux. And even more from the changed language of Thiers, previously procrastinating and equivocal, he now suddenly became insolent, threatening, brutal. The Versailles forces took the redoubt of Moulins-Sacquet on the southern front. On May 3rd, on the 9th, Fort Issy, which had been completely reduced to ruins by gunfire. On the 14th, Fort Vams. On the western front they advanced gradually, capturing the numerous villages and buildings which extended up to the city wall, until they reached the main defenses. On the 21st, thanks to treachery and the carelessness of the National Guard stationed there, they succeeded in forcing their way into the city. The Prussians, who held the northern and eastern forts, allowed the Versailles troops to advance across the land north of the city, which was forbidden ground to them under the armistice, and thus to march forward, attacking on a wide front, which the Parisians naturally thought covered by the armistice, and therefore held only weakly. As a result of this, only a weak resistance was put up in the western half of Paris. In the luxury city proper, it grew stronger and more tenacious the nearer the incoming troops approached the eastern half, the working-class city proper. It was only after 8 days' fighting that the last defenders of the Commune succumbed on the heights of Belleville and Menilmontant, and then the massacre of defenseless men, women and children, which had been raging all through the week on an increasing scale, reached its zenith. The breechloaders could no longer kill fast enough. The vanquished were shot down in hundreds by mitrailleuse fire. The wall of the Federals at the Père Lachaise cemetery, where the final mass murder was consummated, is still standing today, a mute but eloquent testimony to the frenzy of which the ruling class is capable as soon as the working class dares to stand up for its rights. Then, when the slaughter of them all proved to be impossible, came the mass arrests, the shooting of victims arbitrarily selected from the prisoners' ranks, and the removal of the rest to great camps where they awaited trial by courts martial. The Prussian troops surrounding the northeastern half of Paris had orders not to allow any fugitives to pass, but the officers often shut their eyes when the soldiers paid more obedience to the dictates of humanity than to those of the supreme command. Particular honor is due to the Saxon Army Corps, which behaved very humanely and let through many who were obviously fighters for the Commune. Friedrich Engels, London, on the 20th anniversary of the Paris Commune, March 18, 1891.
The Civil War in France, by Karl Marx, Chapter 3.
On the dawn of the 18th of March, Paris arose to the thunder burst of Vive la Commune. What is the Commune, that sphinx so tantalizing to the bourgeois mind? The proletarians of Paris, said the Central Committee in its manifesto of the 18th of March, amidst the failures and treasons of the ruling classes, have understood that the hour has struck for them to save the situation by taking into their own hands the direction of public affairs. They have understood that it is their imperious duty and their absolute right to render themselves masters of their own destinies by seizing upon the governmental power. But the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. The centralized state power, with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judicature, organs wrought after the plan of a systematic and hierarchic division of labor, originates from the days of absolute monarchy, serving nascent middle-class society as a mighty weapon in its struggles against feudalism. Still, its development remained clogged by all manner of medieval rubbish, seigneurial rights, local privileges, municipal and guild monopolies, and provincial constitutions. The gigantic broom of the French Revolution of the 18th century swept away all these relics of bygone times, thus clearing simultaneously the social soil of its last hindrances to the superstructure of the modern state edifice raised under the First Empire, itself the offspring of the coalition wars of old semi-feudal Europe against modern France. During the subsequent regimes, the government, placed under parliamentary control, that is, under the direct control of the propertied classes, became not only a hotbed of huge national debts and crushing taxes, with its irresistible allurements of place, health, and patronage, it became not only the bone of contention between the rival factions and adventurers of the ruling classes, but its political character changed simultaneously with the economic changes of society. At the same pace at which the progress of modern industry developed, widened, intensified the class antagonism between capital and labor. The state power assumed more and more the character of the national power of capital over labor, of a public force organized for social enslavement, of an engine of class despotism. After every revolution marking a progressive phase in the class struggle, the purely repressive character of the state power stands out in bolder and bolder relief. The Revolution of 1830, resulting in the transfer of government from the landlords to the capitalists, transferred it from the more remote to the more direct antagonists of the working men, the bourgeois Republicans, who, in the name of the Revolution of February, took the state power, used it for the June massacres, in order to convince the working class that social republic meant the republic ensuring their social subjection, and in order to convince the royalist bulk of the bourgeois and landlord class that they might safely leave the cares and emoluments of government to the bourgeois Republicans. However, after their one heroic exploit of June, the bourgeois Republicans had, from the front, to fall back to the rear of the party of order, a combination formed by all the rival fractions and factions of the appropriating class in their now openly declared antagonism to the producing classes. The proper form of their joint stock government was the parliamentary republic, with Louis Bonaparte for its president. Theirs was a regime of avowed class terrorism and deliberate insult towards the vile multitude. If the parliamentary republic, as M. Thiers said, divided them, the different fractions of the ruling class, least, it opened an abyss between that class and the whole body of society outside their spare ranks. The restraints by which their own divisions had under former regimes still checked the state power were removed by their union, and in view of the threatening upheaval of the proletariat, they now use that state power mercilessly and ostentatiously as the national war engine of capital against labor. In their uninterrupted crusade against the producing masses they were, however, bound not only to invest the executive with continually increased powers of repression, but at the same time to divest their own parliamentary stronghold, the National Assembly, one by one, of all its own means of defense against the executive. The executive, in the person of Louis Bonaparte, turned them out. The natural offspring of the party of order republic was the Second Empire. The empire, with the coup d'etat for its certificate of birth, universal suffrage for its sanction, and the sword for its scepter, professed to rest upon the peasantry, the large mass of producers not directly involved in the struggle of capital and labor. It professed to save the working class by breaking down parliamentarism, and, with it, the undisguised subserviency of government to the propertied classes. It professed to save the propertied classes by upholding their economic supremacy over the working class, and, finally, it professed to unite all classes by reviving for all the chimera of national glory. In reality, it was the only form of government possible at a time when the bourgeoisie had already lost, and the working class lead not yet acquired, the faculty of ruling the nation. It was acclaimed throughout the world as the savior of society. Under its sway, bourgeois society, freed from political cares, attained a development unexpected even by itself. Its industry and commerce expanded to colossal dimensions. Financial swindling celebrated cosmopolitan orgies. The misery of the masses was set off by a shameless display of gorgeous, meretricious, and debased luxury. The state power, apparently soaring high above society, was at the same time itself the greatest scandal of that society and the very hotbed of all its corruptions. Its own rottenness, and the rottenness of the society it had saved, were laid bare by the bayonet of Prussia, herself eagerly bent upon transferring the supreme seat of that regime from Paris to Berlin. Imperialism is, at the same time, the most prostitute and the ultimate form of the state power which nascent middle-class society had commenced to elaborate as a means of its own emancipation from feudalism, and which full-grown bourgeois society had finally transformed into a means for the enslavement of labor by capital. The direct antithesis to the empire was the commune, the cry of social republic, with which the Revolution of February was ushered in by the Paris proletariats, did but express a vague aspiration after a republic that was not only to supersede the monarchical form of class rule, but class rule itself. The commune was the positive form of that republic. Paris, the central seat of the old governmental power, and, at the same time, the social stronghold of the French working class, had risen in arms against the attempt of Thiers and the rurals to restore and perpetuate that old governmental power bequeathed to them by the empire. Paris could resist only because, in consequence of the siege, it had got rid of the army and replaced it by a national guard, the bulk of which consisted of working men. This fact was now to be transformed into an institution. The first decree of the Commune, therefore, was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people. The Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short turns. The majority of its members were naturally working men, or acknowledged representatives of the working class. The Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary, body, executive and legislative at the same time. instead of continuing to be the agent of the central government. The police was at once stripped of its political attributes and turned into the responsible and at all times revocable agent of the commune. So were the officials of all other branches of the administration. From the members of the commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workmen's wages. The vested interests and the representation allowances of the high dignitaries of state disappeared along with the high dignitaries themselves. Public functions ceased to be the private property of the tools of the central government. Not only municipal administration, but the whole initiative hitherto exercised by the state was laid into the hands of the commune. Having once got rid of the standing army and the police, the physical force elements of the old government, the commune was anxious to break the spiritual force of repression, the parson power, by the disestablishment and disendowment of all churches as proprietary bodies. The priests were sent back to the recesses of private life, there to feed upon the alms of the faithful in imitation of their predecessors, the apostles. The whole of the educational institutions were opened to the people gratuitously, and at the same time cleared of all interference of church and state. Thus, not only was education made accessible to all, but science itself freed from the fetters which class prejudice and governmental force had imposed upon it. The judicial functionaries were to be divested of that sham independence which had but served to mask their abject subserviency to all succeeding governments to which, in turn, they had taken and broken the oaths of allegiance. Like the rest of public servants, magistrates and judges were to be elective, responsible, and revocable. The Paris Commune was, of course, to serve as a model to all the great industrial centers of France. The communal regime once established in Paris and the secondary centers, the old centralized government would in the provinces, too, have to give way to the self-government of the producers. In a rough sketch of national organization which the commune had no time to develop, it states clearly that the commune was to be the political form of even the smallest country hamlet, and that in the rural districts the standing army was to be replaced by a national militia, with an extremely short term of service. The rural communes of every district were to administer their common affairs by an assembly of delegates in the central town, and these district assemblies were again to send deputies to the national delegation in Paris, each delegate to be at any time revocable and bound by the Madd Addam formal instructions of his constituents. The few but important functions which still would remain for a central government were not to be suppressed, as has been intentionally misstated, but were to be discharged by communal, and therefore strictly responsible agents. The unity of the nation was not to be broken, but, on the contrary, to be organized by the communal constitution, and to become a reality by the destruction of the state power which claimed to be the embodiment of that unity independent of, and superior to, the nation itself, from which it was but a parasitic excrescence. While the merely repressive organs of the old governmental power were to be amputated, its legitimate functions were to be wrested from an authority usurping preeminence over society itself, and restored to the responsible agents of society. Instead of deciding once in 3 or 6 years which member of the ruling class was to represent the people in Parliament, universal suffrage was to serve the people, constituted in communes, as individual suffrage serves every other employer in the search for the workmen and managers in his business. And it is well known that companies, like individuals, in matters of real business generally know how to put the right man in the right place, and, if they for once make a mistake, to redress it promptly. On the other hand, nothing could be more foreign to the spirit of the commune than to supersede universal suffrage by hierarchic investiture. It is generally the fate of completely new historical creations to be mistaken for the counterpart of older and even defunct forms of social life, to which they may bear a certain likeness. Thus, this new commune, which breaks the modern state power, has been mistaken for a reproduction of the medieval communes, which first preceded, and afterwards became the substratum of that very state power. The communal constitution has been mistaken for an attempt to break up into a federation of small states, as dreamt of by Montesquieu and the Girondins, that unity of great nations which, if originally brought about by political force, has now become a powerful coefficient of social production. The antagonism of the commune against the state power has been mistaken for an exaggerated form of the ancient struggle against over-centralization. Peculiar historical circumstances may have prevented the classical development, as in France, of the bourgeois form of government, and may have allowed, as in England, to complete the great central state organs by corrupt vestries, jobbing councillors, and ferocious poor law guardians in the towns, and virtually hereditary magistrates in the counties. The communal constitution would have restored to the social body all the forces hitherto absorbed by the state parasite feeding upon and clogging the free movement of society. By this one act it would have initiated the regeneration of France. The provincial French middle class saw in the Commune an attempt to restore the away their order had held over the country under Louis Philippe, and which, under Louis Napoleon, was supplanted by the pretended rule of the country over the towns. In reality, the communal constitution brought the rural producers under the intellectual lead of the central towns of their districts, and there secured to them, in the working man, the natural trustees of their interests. The very existence of the Commune involved, as a matter of course, local municipal liberty, but no longer as a check upon the now superseded state power. It could only enter into the head of a Bismarck, who, when not engaged on his intrigues of blood and iron, always likes to resume his old trade, so befitting his mental caliber of contributor to Kladderadatsch, the Berlin Punch. It could only enter in such a head. To ascribe to the Paris Commune aspirations after that caricature of the old French municipal organization of 1791, the Prussian municipal constitution which degrades the town governments to mere secondary wheels in the police machinery of the Prussian state, the Commune made that catchword of bourgeois revolutions, cheap government, a reality, by destroying the two greatest sources of expenditure, the standing army and state functionarism. Its very existence presupposed the non-existence of monarchy, which, in Europe at least, is the normal encumbrance and indispensable cloak of class rule. It supplied the republic with the basis of really democratic institutions. But neither cheap government nor the true republic was its ultimate aim. They were its mere concomitants. The multiplicity of interpretations to which the Commune has been subjected, and the multiplicity of interests which construed it in their favor, show that it was a thoroughly expansive political form, while all previous forms of government had been emphatically repressive. Its true secret was this: it was essentially a working-class government, the produce of the struggle of the producing against the appropriating class, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labor. Except on this last condition, the communal constitution would have been an impossibility and a delusion. The political rule of the producer cannot coexist with the perpetuation of his social slavery. The Commune was therefore to serve as a lever for uprooting the economical foundations upon which rests the existence of classes, and therefore of class rule. With labor emancipated, every man becomes a working man, and productive labor ceases to be a class attribute. It is a strange fact, in spite of all the tall talk and all the immense literature, for the last 60 years, about emancipation of labor, no sooner do the working men anywhere take the subject into their own hands with a will, than uprises at once all the apologetic phraseology of the mouthpieces of present society with its two roles of capital and wage slaver. The landlord now is but the seeping partner of the capitalist, as if capitalist society was still in its purest state of virgin innocence, with its antagonisms still undeveloped, with its delusions still unexploded, with its prostitute realities not yet laid bare. The Commune, they exclaim, intends to abolish property, the basis of all civilization. Yes, gentlemen, the Commune intended to abolish that class property which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few. It aimed at the expropriation of the expropriators. It wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production, land and capital, now chiefly the means of enslaving and exploiting labor, into mere instruments of free and associated labor. But this is communism, impossible communism. Why, those members of the ruling classes who are intelligent enough to perceive the impossibility of continuing the present system, and they are many, have become the obtrusive and full-mouthed apostles of cooperative production. If cooperative production is not to remain a sham and a snare, if it is to supersede the capitalist system, if united cooperative societies are to regulate national production upon a common plan, thus taking it under their own control, and putting an end to the constant anarchy and periodical convulsions which are the fatality of capitalist production, what else, gentlemen, would it be but communism, possible communism? The working class did not expect miracles from the Commune. They have no ready-made utopias to introduce par decret du people. They know that in order to work out their own emancipation, and along with it that higher form to which present society is irresistibly tending, by its own economical agencies, they will have to pass through long struggles, through a series of historic processes, transforming circumstances and men. They have no ideals to realize, but to set free the elements of the new society with which old collapsing bourgeois society itself is pregnant. In the full consciousness of their historic mission, and with the heroic resolve to act up to it, the working class can afford to smile at the coarse invective of the gentleman's gentleman with the pen and inkhorn, and at the didactic patronage of well-wishing bourgeois doctrinaires, pouring forth their ignorant platitudes and sectarian crotchets in the oracular tone of scientific infallibility. When the Paris Commune took the management of the revolution in its own hands, when plain working men for the first time dared to infringe upon the governmental privilege of their natural superiors, and, under circumstances of unexampled difficulty, performed their work modestly, conscientiously, and efficiently, performed it at salaries the highest of which barely amounted to 1/5 of what, according to high scientific authority, is the minimum required for a secretary to a certain metropolitan school board. The old world writhed in convulsions of rage at the sight of the red flag, the symbol of the Republic of Labor, floating over the Hotel de Ville. And yet, this was the first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, even by the great bulk of the Paris middle-class shopkeepers, tradesmen, merchants, the wealthy capitalists alone excepted. The Commune had saved them by a sagacious settlement of that ever-recurring cause of dispute among the middle class themselves, the debtor and creditor accounts. The same portion of the middle class, after they had assisted in putting down the working men's insurrection of June 1848, had been at once unceremoniously sacrificed to their creditors by the then Constituent Assembly. But this was not their only motive for now rallying round the working class. They felt there was but one alternative, the Commune, or the Empire, under whatever name it might reappear. The Empire had ruined them economically by the havoc it made of public wealth, by the wholesale financial swindling it fostered, by the props it lent to the artificially accelerated centralization of capital, and the concomitant expropriation of their own ranks. It has suppressed them politically. It has shocked them morally by its orgies. It had insulted their Voltaireism by handing over the education of their children to the Frères Ignorantins. It had revolted their national feeling as Frenchmen by precipitating them headlong into a war which left only one equivalent for the ruins it made, the disappearance of the Empire. In fact, after the exodus from Paris of the high Bonapartist and capitalist Boheme, the true middle-class party of order came out in the shape of the Union Républicaine, enrolling themselves under the colors of the Commune and defending it against the willful misconstruction of fears. Whether the gratitude of this great body of the middle class will stand the present severe trial, time must show. The Commune was perfectly right in telling the peasants that its victory was their only hope. Of all the lies hatched at Versailles and re-echoed by the glorious European penny a liner, one of the most tremendous was that the rurals represented the French peasantry. Think only of the love of the French peasant for the men to whom, after 1815, he had to pay the milliard of indemnity. In the eyes of the French peasant, the very existence of a great landed proprietary is in itself an encroachment on his conquests of 1789. The bourgeoisie, in 1848, had burthened his plot of land with the additional tax of 45 cents in the franc, but then he did so in the name of the revolution, while now he had fomented a civil war against the revolution, to shift on the peasants' shoulders the chief load of the 5 milliards of indemnity to be paid to the Prussian. The Commune, on the other hand, in one of its first proclamations, declared that the true originators of the war would be made to pay its cost. The Commune would have delivered the peasant of the blood tax, would have given him a cheap government, transformed his present bloodsuckers, the notary, advocate, executor, and other judicial vampires, into salaried communal agents, elected by and responsible to himself. It would have freed him of the tyranny of the guard champetre, the gendarme, and the prefect, would have put enlightenment by the schoolmaster in the place of stultification by the priest. And the French peasant is, above all, a man of reckoning. He would find it extremely reasonable that the pay of the priest, instead of being extorted by the tax-gatherer, should only depend upon the spontaneous action of the parishioner's religious instincts. Such were the great immediate boons which the rule of the Commune, and that rule alone, held out to the French peasantry. It is, therefore, quite superfluous here to expatiate upon the more complicated but vital problems which the Commune alone was able, and at the same time compelled, to solve in favor of the peasant, viz. the apothecary debt, lying like an incubus upon his parcel of soil, the proletariat foncier, the rural proletariat, daily growing upon it, and his expropriation from it enforced, at a more and more rapid rate, by the very development of modern agriculture and the competition of capitalist farming. The French peasant had elected Louis Bonaparte president of the Republic, but the party of order created the empire. What the French peasant really wants he commenced to show in 1849 and 1850, by opposing his mayor to the government's prefect, his schoolmaster to the government's priest, and himself to the government's gendarme. All the laws made by the party of order in January and February 1850 were avowed measures of repression against the peasant. The peasant was a Bonapartist because the Great Revolution, with all its benefits to him, was, in his eyes, personified in Napoleon. This delusion, rapidly breaking down under the Second Empire, and in its very nature hostile to the rurals, this prejudice of the past, how could it have withstood the appeal of the Commune to the living interests and urgent wants of the peasantry? The rurals, this was, in fact, their chief apprehension, knew that 3 months' free communication of communal Paris with the provinces would bring about a general rising of the peasants, and hence their anxiety to establish a police blockade around Paris, so as to stop the spread of the Rinderpest. If the Commune was thus the true representative of all the healthy elements of French society, and therefore the truly national government, it was, at the same time, a working men's government, as the bold champion of the emancipation of labor, emphatically international. Within sight of the Prussian army that had annexed to Germany 2 French provinces, the Commune annexed to France the working people all over the world. The Second Empire had been the jubilee of cosmopolitan blacklegism, the rakes of all countries rushing in at its call for a share at its orgies and in the plunder of the French people. Even at this moment the right hand of Thiers is Gainscow, the foul Wallachian, and his left hand is Markowski, the Russian spy. The Commune admitted all foreigners to the honor of dying for the immortal cause. Between the foreign war lost by their treason and the civil war fomented by their conspiracy with the foreign invader, the bourgeoisie had found the time to display their patriotism by organizing police hunts upon the Germans in France. The Commune made a German working man its minister of labor. Thiers, the bourgeoisie, the Second Empire, had continually deluded Poland by loud professions of sympathy, while in reality betraying her to, and doing the dirty work of, Russia. The Commune honored the heroic sons of Poland by placing them at the head of the defenders of Paris. And, to broadly mark the new era of history, it was conscious of initiating, under the eyes of the conquering Prussians on the one side and of the Bonapartist army, led by Bonapartist generals, on the other, the Commune pulled down that colossal symbol of martial glory, the Vendome column. The great social measure of the Commune was its own working existence. Its special measures could but betoken the tendency of a government of the people by the people. Such were the abolition of the night work of journeyman bakers, the prohibition, under penalty, of the employer's practice to reduce wages by levying upon their workpeople fines under manifold pretexts, a process in which the employer combines in his own person the parts of legislator, judge, and executioner, and filches the money to boot. Another measure of this class was the surrender, to associations of workmen, under reserve of compensation, of all closed workshops and factories, no matter whether the respective capitalists had absconded or preferred to strike work. The financial measures of the Commune, remarkable for their sagacity and moderation, could only be such as were compatible with the state of a besieged town. Considering the colossal robberies committed upon the city of Paris by the great financial companies and contractors, under the protection of Haussmann, the Commune would have had an incomparably better title to confiscate their property than Louis Napoleon had against the Orleans family. The Hohenzollern and the English oligarchs, who both have derived a good deal of their estates from church plunder, were, of course, greatly shocked at the Commune clearing but 8f out of secularization, while the Versailles government, as soon as it had recovered some spirit and strength, used the most violent means against the Commune, while it put down the free expression of opinion all over France, even to the forbidding of meetings of delegates from the large towns, while it subjected Versailles and the rest of France to an espionage far surpassing that of the Second Empire, while it burned by its gendarme inquisitors all papers printed at Paris and sifted all correspondence from into Paris, while in the National Assembly the most timid attempts to put in a word for Paris were howled down in a manner unknown even to the Chamber Intriumphable of 1816, with the savage warfare of Versailles outside, and its attempts at corruption and conspiracy inside Paris. Would the Commune not have shamefully betrayed its trust by affecting to keep up all the decencies and appearances of liberalism as in a time of profound peace? Had the government of the Commune been akin to that of Thiers, there would have been no more occasion to suppress party of order papers at Paris than there was to suppress communal papers at Versailles. It was irritating, indeed, to the rurals that at the very same time they declared the return to the church to be the only means of salvation for France, the infidel Commune unearthed the peculiar mysteries of the Picpus nunnery and of the Church of St. Laurent. It was a satire upon Thiers that, while he showered grand crosses upon the Bonapartist generals in acknowledgment of their mastery in losing battles, signing capitulations, and turning cigarettes at Wilhelmshoe, the Commune dismissed and arrested its generals whenever they were suspected of neglecting their duties. The expulsion from, and arrest by, the Commune of one of its members who had slipped in under a false name, and had undergone at Lyons 6 days' imprisonment for simple bankruptcy, was it not a deliberate insult hurled at the forger, Jules Favre, then still the foreign minister of France, still selling France to Bismarck, and still dictating his orders to that paragon government of Belgium? But, indeed, the Commune did not pretend to infallibility, the invariable attribute of all governments of the old stamp. It published its doings and sayings. It initiated the public into all its shortcomings. In every revolution there intrude, at the side of its true agents, men of a different stamp, some of them survivors of and devotees to past revolutions, without insight into the present movement, but preserving popular influence by their known honesty and courage, or by the sheer force of tradition. Others mere ballers, who by dint of repeating year after year the same set of stereotype, declamation against the government of the day, have sneaked into the reputation of revolutionists of the first water. After 18th of March, some such men did also turn up, and in some cases contrived to play preeminent parts. As far as their power went, They hampered the real action of the working class, exactly as men of that sort have hampered the full development of every previous revolution. They are an unavoidable evil. With time they are shaken off, but time was not allowed to the Commune. Wonderful, indeed, was the change the Commune had wrought in Paris. No longer any trace of the meretricious Paris of the Second Empire. No longer was Paris the rendezvous of British landlords, Irish absentees, American ex-slaveholders and shoddy men, Russian ex-serf owners, and Wallachian boyards. No more corpses at the morgue, no nocturnal burglaries, scarcely any robberies. In fact, for the first time since the days of February 1848, the streets of Paris were safe, and that without any police of any kind. "We," said a member of the Commune, "hear no longer of assassination, theft, and personal assault. It seems, indeed, as if the police had dragged along with it to Versailles all its conservative friends. The cocottes had refound the scent of their protectors, the absconding men of family, religion, and, above all, of property. In their stead, the real women of Paris showed again at the surface, heroic, noble, and devoted, like the women of antiquity, working, thinking, fighting, bleeding Paris, almost forgetful, in its incubation of a new society, of the cannibals at its gates radiant in the enthusiasm of its historic initiative. Opposed to this new world at Paris, behold the old world at Versailles, that assembly of the ghouls of all defunct regimes, legitimists and Orleanists, eager to feed upon the carcass of the nation, with a tale of antediluvian republicans, sanctioning, by their presence in the assembly, the slaveholders' rebellion, relying for the maintenance of their parliamentary republic upon the vanity of the senile mountebank at its head, and caricaturing 1789 by holding their ghastly meetings in the Jeu de Paume. There it was, this assembly, the representative of everything dead in France, propped up by the semblance of life by nothing but the swords of the generals of Louis Bonaparte. Paris all truth, Versailles all lie, and that lie vented through the mouth of Thiers. Thiers tells a deputation of the mayors of the Seine Etois, "You may rely upon my word, which I have never broken." He tells the assembly itself that it was the most freely elected and most liberal assembly France ever possessed. He tells his motley soldiery that it was the admiration of the world, and the finest army France ever possessed. He tells the provinces that the bombardment of Paris by him was a myth, if some cannon shots have been fired. It is not the deed of the army of Versailles, but of some insurgents trying to make believe that they are fighting, while they dare not show their faces. He again tells the provinces that the artillery of Versailles does not bombard Paris, but only cannonades it. He tells the Archbishop of Paris that the pretended executions and reprisals attributed to the Versailles troops were all moonshine. He tells Paris that he was only anxious to free it from the hideous tyrants who oppress it, and that, in fact, the Paris of the Commune was but a handful of criminals. The Paris of M. Thiers was not the real Paris of the vile multitude, but a phantom Paris, the Paris of the Francs Fileurs, the Paris of the boulevards, male and female, the rich, the capitalist, the gilded, the idle Paris, now thronging with its lackeys, its blacklegs, its literary boheme, and its cocottes at Versailles, Saint Denis, Rouen, and Saint Germain, considering the Civil War but an agreeable diversion, eyeing the battle going on through telescopes, counting the rounds of cannon, and swearing by their own honor and that of their prostitutes, that the performance was far better got up than it used to be at the Porte Saint Martin. The men who fell were really dead. The cries of the wounded were cries in good earnest, and, besides, the whole thing was so intensely historical. This is the Paris of M. Thiers, as the emigration of Coblentz was the France of M. de Calonne.
Chapter 4.
The first attempt of the slaveholders' conspiracy to put down Paris by getting the Prussians to occupy it was frustrated by Bismarck's refusal. The second attempt, that of the 18th of March, ended in the rout of the army and the flight to Versailles of the government, which ordered the whole administration to break up and follow in its track. By the semblance of peace negotiations with Paris, Thiers found the time to prepare for war against it. But where to find an army? The remnants of the line regiments were weak in number and unsafe in character. His urgent appeal to the provinces to succor Versailles by their national guards and volunteers met with a flat refusal. Brittany alone furnished a handful of chowdas fighting under a white flag, every one of them wearing on his breast the heart of Jesus in white cloth, and shouting Vive le Roi! Long live the King! Thiers was, therefore, compelled to collect, in hot haste, a motley crew, composed of sailors, marines, pontifical zouaves, Valentins gendarmes, and Pietries sergeants de ville and mouchards. This army, however, would have been ridiculously ineffective without the installments of imperialist war prisoners, which Bismarck granted in numbers just sufficient to keep the Civil War going, and keep the Versailles government in abject dependence on Prussia. During the war itself, the Versailles police had to look after the Versailles army, while the gendarmes had to drag it on by exposing themselves at all posts of danger. The forts which tell were not taken but bought. The heroism of the Federals convinced Thiers that the resistance of Paris was not to be broken by his own strategic genius and the bayonets at his disposal. Meanwhile, his relations with the provinces became more and more difficult. Not one single address of approval came in to gladden Thiers and his rurals. Quite the contrary, deputations and addresses demanding, in a tone anything but respectful, conciliation with Paris on the basis of the unequivocal recognition of the Republic, the acknowledgement of the communal liberties, and the dissolution of the National Assembly, whose mandate was extinct, poured in from all sides, and in such numbers that Dufour, Thiers' Minister of Justice, in his circular of April 23 to the public prosecutors, commanded them to treat the cry of conciliation as a crime. In regard, however, of the hopeless prospect held out by his campaign, Thiers resolved to shift his tactics by ordering, all over the country, municipal elections to take place on the 30th of April, on the basis of the new municipal law dictated by himself to the National Assembly. What with the intrigues of his prefects, what with police intimidation, he felt quite sanguine of imparting, by the verdict of the provinces, to the National Assembly that moral power it had never possessed, and of getting at last from the provinces the physical force required for the conquest of Paris. His banditti warfare against Paris, exalted in his own bulletins, and the attempts of his ministers at the establishment, throughout France, of a reign of terror, Thiers was from the beginning anxious to accompany with a little byplay of conciliation, which had to serve more than one purpose. It was to dupe the provinces, to inveigle the middle-class element in Paris, and, above all, to afford the professed Republicans in the National Assembly the opportunity of hiding their treason against Paris behind their faith in Thiers. On the 21st of March, when still without an army, he had declared to the Assembly, "Come what may, I will not send an army to Paris." On the 27th of March he rose again. "I have found the Republic an accomplished fact, and I am firmly resolved to maintain it." In reality, he put down the revolution at Lyons and Marseille in the name of the Republic, while the roars of his rurals drowned the very mention of its name at Versailles. After this exploit, he toned down the accomplished fact into an hypothetical fact. The Orleans princes, whom he had cautiously warned off Bordeaux, were now, in flagrant breach of the law, permitted to intrigue at Dieppe. The concessions held out by Thiers in his interminable interviews with the delegates from Paris and the provinces, although constantly varied in tone and color, according to time and circumstances, did in fact never come to more than the prospective restriction of revenge to the handful of criminals implicated in the murder of Lecomte and Clement Thomas, on the well-understood premise that Paris and France were unreservedly to accept M. Thiers himself as the best of possible republics, as he, in 1830, had done with Louis Philippe. Even these concessions he not only took care to render doubtful by the official comments put upon them in the Assembly through his ministers. He had his Dufour to act. Dufour, this old Orleanist lawyer, had always been the justiciary of the state of siege, as now in 1871 under Thiers, so in 1839 under Louis Philippe, and in 1849 under Louis Bonaparte's presidency. While out of office he made a fortune by pleading for the Paris capitalists, and made political capital by pleading against the laws he had himself originated. He now hurried through the National Assembly not only a set of repressive laws which were, after the fall of Paris, to extirpate the last remnants of republican liberty in France. He foreshadowed the fate of Paris by abridging the, for him, too slow procedure of courts-martial, and by a newfangled, draconic code of deportation. The Revolution of 1848, abolishing the penalty of death for political crimes, had replaced it by deportation. Louis Bonaparte did not dare, at least not in theory, to re-establish the regime of the guillotine. The Rural Assembly, not yet bold enough even to hint that the Parisians were not rebels, but assassins, had therefore to confine its prospective vengeance against Paris to Dufour's new code of deportation. Under all these circumstances, Thiers himself could not have gone on with his comedy of conciliation, had it not, as he intended it to do, drawn forth shrieks of rage from the rurals, whose ruminating mind did neither understand the play, nor its necessities of hypocrisy, tergiversation, and procrastination. In sight of the impending municipal elections of the 30th of April, Thiers enacted one of his great conciliation scenes on the 27th April. Amidst a flood of sentimental rhetoric, he exclaimed from the tribune of the Assembly, "There exists no conspiracy against the Republic but that of Paris, which compels us to shed French blood. I repeat it again and again. Let those impious arms fall from the hands which hold them, and chastisement will be arrested at once by an act of peace excluding only the small number of criminals." To the violent interruption of the rurals he replied, "Gentlemen, tell me, I implore you, am I wrong? Do you really regret that I could have stated the truth that the criminals are only a handful? Is it not fortunate in the midst of our misfortunes that those who have been capable to shed the blood of Clement Thomas and General Lecomte are but rare exceptions? France, however, turned a deaf ear to what Thiers flattered himself to be a parliamentary siren's song. Out of 700,000 municipal councillors returned by the 35,000 communes still left to France, the United Legitimists, Orleanists, and Bonapartists did not carry 8,000. The supplementary elections which followed were still more decidedly hostile. Thus, instead of getting from the provinces the badly needed physical force, the National Assembly lost even its last claim of moral force, that of being the expression of the universal suffrage of the country. To complete the discomfiture, the newly chosen municipal councils of all the cities of France openly threatened the usurping assembly at Versailles with a counter-assembly at Bordeaux. Then the long-expected moment of decisive action had at last come for Bismarck. He peremptorily summoned Thiers to send to Frankfurt plenipotentiaries for the definitive settlement of peace. In humble obedience to the call of his master, Thiers hastened to dispatch his trusty Jules Favre, backed by Pau-Air-Cordier. Pau-Air-Cordier, an eminent round cotton spinner, a fervent and even servile partisan of the Second Empire, had never found any fault with it save its commercial treaty with England, prejudicial to his own shop interest. Hardly installed at Bordeaux as Thiers' Minister of Finance, he denounced that unholy treaty, hinted at its near abrogation, and had even the effrontery to try, although in vain, having counted without Bismarck, the immediate enforcement of the old protective duties against Alsace, where, he said, no previous international treaties stood in the way. This man, who considered counter-revolution as a means to put down wages at Rouen, and the surrender of French provinces as a means to bring up the price of his wares in France, was he not the one predestined to be picked out by Thiers as the helpmate of Jules Favre in his last and crowning treason? On the arrival at Frankfurt of this exquisite pair of plenipotentiaries, bully Bismarck at once met them with the imperious alternative, either the restoration of the empire, or the unconditional acceptance of my own peace terms. These terms included a shortening of the intervals in which the war indemnity was to be paid, and the continued occupation of the Paris forts by Prussian troops until Bismarck should feel satisfied with the state of things in France, Prussia thus being recognized as the supreme arbiter in internal French politics. In return for this he offered to let loose, for the extermination of Paris, the captive Bonapartist army, and to lend them the direct assistance of Emperor William's troops. He pledged his good faith by making payment of the first installment of the indemnity dependent on the pacification of Paris. Such a bait was, of course, eagerly swallowed by Thiers and his plenipotentiaries. They signed the Treaty of Peace on the 10th of May, and had it endorsed by the Versailles Assembly on the 18th. In the interval between the conclusion of peace and the arrival of the Bonapartist prisoners, Thiers felt more bound to resume his comedy of conciliation as his Republican tools stood in sore need of a pretext for blinking their eyes at the preparations for the carnage of Paris. As late as the 18th of May he replied to a deputation of middle-class conciliators, "Whatever the insurgents will make up their minds for capitulation, the gates of Paris shall be flung wide open during a week for all except the murderers of Generals Clement Thomas and Lecomte." A few days afterwards, when violently interpellated on these promises by the rurals, he refused to enter into any explanations, not, however, without giving them this significant hint: "I tell you there are impatient men amongst you, men who are in too great a hurry. They must have another 8 days. At the end of these 8 days there will be no more danger, and the task will be proportionate to their courage and to their capacities." As soon as MacMahon was able to assure him that he could shortly enter Paris, Thiers declared to the Assembly that he would enter Paris with the laws in his hands, and demand a full expiation from the wretches who had sacrificed the lives of soldiers and destroyed public monuments. As the moment of decision drew near he said to the Assembly, "I shall be pitiless." To Paris, that it was due, and to his Bonapartist banditti, that they had state license to wreak vengeance upon Paris to their heart's content. At last, when treachery had opened the gates of Paris to General Douai, on the 21st of May, Thiers, on the 22nd, revealed to the rurals the goal of his conciliation comedy, which they had so obstinately persisted in not understanding. "I told you a few days ago that we were approaching our goal. Today I came to tell you the goal is reached. The victory of order, justice, and civilization is at last won." So it was. The civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stand forth as undisguised savagery and lawless revenge. Each new crisis in the class struggle between the appropriator and the producer brings out this fact more glaringly. Even the atrocities of the bourgeois in June 1848 vanished before the ineffable infamy 1871. The self-sacrificing heroism with which the population of Paris, men, women, and children, fought for 8 days after the entrance of the Versailles reflects as much the grandeur of their cause as the infernal deeds of the soldiery reflect the innate spirit of that civilization of which they are the mercenary vindicators. A glorious civilization, indeed, the great problem of which is how to get rid of the heaps of corpses it made after the battle was over. To find a parallel for the conduct of Fiers and his bloodhounds, we must go back to the times of Sulla and the two triumvirates of Rome. The same wholesale slaughter in cold blood, the same disregard in massacre of age and sex, the same system of torturing prisoners, the same prescriptions, but this time of a whole class, the same savage hunt after concealed leaders, lest one might escape, the same denunciations of political and private enemies, the same indifference for the butchery of entire strangers to the feud. There is but this difference, that the Romans had no mitrailleuses for the dispatch in the lump of the prescribed, and that they had not the law in their hands, nor on their lips the cry of civilization. And after those horrors, look upon the other, still more hideous, face of that bourgeois civilization as described by its own press. With stray shots, writes the Paris correspondent of a London Tory paper, still ringing in the distance, and untended wounded wretches dying amid the tombstones of Père Lachaise, with 6,000 terror-stricken insurgents wandering in an agony of despair in the labyrinth of the catacombs, and wretches hurried through the streets to be shot down in scores by the mitrailleuse. It is revolting to see the cafes filled with the votaries of absinthe, billiards, and dominoes, female profligacy perambulating the boulevards, and the sound of revelry disturbing the night from the cabinets particuliers of fashionable restaurants. And Edwin Herve writes in the Journal de Paris, a versalist journal suppressed by the Commune, the way in which the population of Paris manifested its satisfaction yesterday was rather more than frivolous, and we fear it will grow worse as time progresses. Paris has now a fete day appearance, which is sadly out of place, and, unless we are to be called the Parisians de la Decadence, this sort of thing must come to an end. And then he quotes the passage from Tacitus, yet, on the morrow of that horrible struggle, even before it was completely over, Rome, degraded and corrupt, began once more to wallow in the voluptuous slough which was destroying its body and polluting its soul. Ali prolia et vulnera, alibi balnea popini, here fights and wounds, there bats in restaurants. Herve only forgets to say that the population of Paris he speaks of is but the population of the Paris of M. Thiers, the Franks fileurs returning in throngs from Versailles, Saint Denis, Rouen, and Saint Germain, the Paris of the decline. In all its bloody triumphs over the self-sacrificing champions of a new and better society, that nefarious civilization, based upon the enslavement of labor, drowns the moans of its victims in a hue and cry of calumny, reverberated by a worldwide echo. The serene workingmen's Paris of the Commune is suddenly changed into a pandemonium by the bloodhounds of order. And what does this tremendous change prove to the bourgeois mind of all countries? Why, that the Commune has conspired against civilization. The Paris people die enthusiastically for the Commune in numbers unequaled in any battle known to history. What does that prove? Why, that the Commune was not the people's own government, but the usurpation of a handful of criminals. The women of Paris joyfully give up their lives at the barricades and on the place of execution. What does this prove? Why, that the demon of the Commune has changed them into Megaras and Hecates. The moderation of the Commune during 2 months of undisputed sway is equaled only by the heroism of its defense. What does that prove? Why, that for months the Commune carefully hid, under a mask of moderation and humanity, the bloodthirstiness of its fiendish instincts, to be let loose in the hour of its agony. The working men's Paris, in the act of its heroic self-holocaust, involved in its flames buildings and monuments. While tearing to pieces the living body of the proletariat, its rulers must no longer expect to return triumphantly into the intact architecture of their abodes. The government of Versailles cries incendiarism, and whispers this cue to all its agents, down to the remotest hamlet, to hunt up its enemies everywhere as suspect of professional incendiarism. The bourgeoisie of the whole world, which looks complacently upon the wholesale massacre after the battle, is convulsed by horror at the desecration of brick and mortar. When governments give state licenses to their navies to kill, burn, and destroy, is that a license for incendiarism? When the British troops wantonly set fire to the Capitol at Washington and to the summer palace of the Chinese emperor, was that incendiarism? When the Prussians, not for military reasons, but out of the mere spite of revenge, burnt down, by the help of petroleum, towns like Shadadun and innumerable villages, was that incendiarism? When Thiers, during 6 weeks, bombarded Paris under the pretext that he wanted to set fire to those houses only in which there were people, was that incendiarism? In war, fire is an arm as legitimate as any. Buildings held by the enemy are shelled to set them on fire. If their defenders have to retire, they themselves light the flames to prevent the attack from making use of the buildings. To be burnt down has always been the inevitable fate of all buildings situated in the front of battle of all the regular armies of the world. but in the war of the enslaved against their enslavers, the only justifiable war in history, this is by no means to hold good. The Commune used fire strictly as a means of defense. They used it to stop up to the Versailles troops those long straight avenues which Haussmann had expressly opened to artillery fire. They used it to cover their retreat, in the same way as the Versailles, in their advance, used their shells which destroyed at least as many buildings as the fire of the Commune. It is a matter of dispute, even now, which buildings were set fire to by the defense, and which by the attack, and the defense resorted to fire only then, when the Versailles troops had already commenced their wholesale murdering of prisoners. Besides, the Commune had, long before, given full public notice that, if driven to extremities, they would bury themselves under the ruins of Paris, and make Paris a second Moscow, as the government of defense, but only as a cloak for its treason, had promised to do. For this purpose Trochu had found them the petroleum. The Commune knew that its opponents cared nothing for the lives of the Paris people, but cared much for their own Paris buildings. And Thiers, on the other hand, had given them notice that he would be implacable in his vengeance. No sooner had he got his army ready on one side, and the Prussians shutting up the trap on the other, than he proclaimed, "I shall be pitiless. The expiation will be complete, and justice will be stern." If the acts of the Paris working men were vandalism, it was the vandalism of defense and despair, not the vandalism of triumph, like that which the Christians perpetrated upon the really priceless art treasures of heathen antiquity. And even that vandalism has been justified by the historian as an unavoidable and comparatively trifling concomitant to the titanic struggle between a new society arising and an old one breaking down. It was still less the vandalism of Haussmann, raising historic Paris to make place for the Paris of the sightseer, but the execution by the Commune of the 64 hostages, with the Archbishop of Paris at their head. The bourgeoisie and its army in June 1848 re-established a custom which had long disappeared from the practice of war, the shooting of their defenseless prisoners. This brutal custom has since been more or less strictly adhered to by the suppressors of all popular commotions in Europe and India, thus proving that it constitutes a real progress of civilization. On the other hand, the Prussians, in France, had re-established the practice of taking hostages innocent men, who, with their lives, were to answer to them for the acts of others. When Thiers, as we have seen, from the very beginning of the conflict, enforced the humane practice of shooting down the communal prisoners, the Commune, to protect their lives, was obliged to resort to the Prussian practice of securing hostages. The lives of the hostages had been forfeited over and over again by the continued shooting of prisoners on the part of the Versailles. How could they be spared any longer after the carnage with which Mahon's praetorians celebrated their entrance into Paris? Was even the last check upon the unscrupulous ferocity of bourgeois governments, the taking of hostages to be made a mere sham of. The real murder of Archbishop D'Arblay is Thiers. The Commune again and again had offered to exchange the Archbishop, and ever so many priests in the bargain, against the single Blanqui, then in the hands of Thiers. Thiers obstinately refused. He knew that with Blanqui he would give to the Commune a head, while the Archbishop would serve his purpose best in the shape of a corpse. Thiers acted upon the precedent of Cavaignac. How, in June 1848, did not Cavaignac and his men of order raise shouts of horror by stigmatizing the insurgents as the assassins of Archbishop Affray? They knew perfectly well that the Archbishop had been shot by the soldiers of order. M. Jacquemart, the Archbishop's vicar general, present on the spot, had immediately afterwards handed them in his evidence to that effect. All this chorus of calumny, which the party of order never fails in their orgies of blood to raise against their victims, only proves that the bourgeois of our days considers himself the legitimate successor to the baron of old, who thought every weapon in his own hand fair against the plebeian, while in the hands of the plebeian a weapon of any kind constituted in itself a crime. The conspiracy of the ruling class to break down the revolution by a civil war carried on under the patronage of the foreign invader. A conspiracy which we have traced from the very 4th of September down to the entrance of Mahon's praetorian through the gate of St. Cloud, culminated in the carnage of parts. Bismarck gloats over the ruins of Paris, in which he saw perhaps the first installment of that general destruction of great cities he had prayed for when still a simple rural in the Prussian chamber intriumphable of 1899. He gloats over the cadavers of the Paris proletariats. For him this is not only the extermination of revolution, but the extinction of France, now decapitated in reality, and by the French government itself. With the shallowness characteristic of a successful statesman, he sees but the surface of this tremendous historic event. Whenever before has history exhibited the spectacle of a conqueror crowning his victory by turning into, not only the gendarme, but the hired bravo of the conquered government? There existed no war between Prussia and the Commune of Paris. On the contrary, the Commune had accepted the peace preliminaries, and Prussia had announced her neutrality. Prussia was, therefore, no belligerent. She acted the part of a bravo, a cowardly bravo, because incurring no danger, a hired bravo, because stipulating beforehand the payment of her blood money of 500 millions on the fall of Paris. And thus, at last, came out the true character of the war, ordained by Providence as a chastisement of godless and debauched France by pious and moral Germany. And this unparalleled breach of the law of nations, even as understood by the old world lawyers, instead of arousing the civilized governments of Europe to declare the felonious Prussian government the mere tool of the St. Petersburg cabinet, an outlaw amongst nations, only incites them to consider whether the few victims who escaped the double cordon around Paris are not to be given up to the hangman at Versailles. That after the most tremendous war of modern times, the conquering and the conquered host should fraternize for the common massacre of the proletariats. This unparalleled event does indicate, not, as Bismarck thinks, the final repression of a new society upheaving, but the crumbling into dust of bourgeois society. The highest heroic effort of which old society is still capable is national war, and this is now proved to be a mere governmental humbug, intended to defer the struggle of the classes, and to be thrown aside as soon as that class struggle bursts out in civil war. Class rule is no longer able to disguise itself in a national uniform. The national governments are one as against the proletariat. After Whit Sunday, 1871, there can be neither peace nor truce possible between the working men of France and the appropriators of their produce. The iron hand of a mercenary soldiery may keep for a time both classes tied down in common oppression, but the battle must break out again and again in ever-growing dimensions, and there can be no doubt as to who will be the victor in the end, the appropriating few or the immense working majority. And the French working class is only the advance guard of the modern proletariat, while the European governments thus testify, before Paris, to the international character of class rule. They cry down the International Working Men's Association, the international counter-organization of labor against the cosmopolitan of capital, as the head fountain of all these disasters. Thiers denounced it as the despot of labor, pretending to be its liberator. Picard ordered that all communications between the French internationals and those abroad should be cut off. Count Jobert, Thiers' mummified accomplice of 1885, declares it the great problem of all civilized governments to weed it out. The rurals roar against it, and the whole European press joins the chorus. An honorable French writer, completely foreign to our association, speaks as follows: the members of the Central Committee of the National Guard, as well as the greater part of the members of the Commune, are the most active, intelligent, and energetic minds of the International Working Men's Association, men who are thoroughly honest, sincere, intelligent, devoted, pure, and fanatical in the good sense of the word. The police-tinged bourgeois mind naturally figures to itself the International Working Men's Association as acting in the manner of a secret conspiracy, its central body ordering, from time to time, explosions in different counties. Our association is, in fact, nothing but the international bond between the most advanced working men in the various countries of the civilized world. Wherever, in whatever shape, and under whatever conditions the class struggle obtains any consistency, it is but natural that members of our association should stand in the foreground. The soil out of which it grows is modern society itself. It cannot be stamped out by any amount of carnage. To stamp it out, the government would have to stamp out the despotism of capital over labor, the condition of their own parasitical existence. Working men's Paris, with its commune, will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its martyrs are enshrined in the great heart of the working class. Its exterminators' history has already nailed to that eternal pillory from which all the prayers of their priest will not avail to redeem them.
This was a dramatization of selections from Karl Marx's pamphlet The Civil War in France, meant to align with the Marx-Engles Reader but sourced from Marxists.org. I hope that this was helpful to your studies. If so, please consider doing any of the relevant YouTube magic that might elevate this channel in the algorithm and go on to help others. Thank you for your praxis and your attention.